Welcome everybody to the Lake Bluff 65 Policy Committee meeting. I am getting it started because we have 3 board members that sit on our policy committee, and that is Julie Gutschall, Leanne Charlot, and Susan Ryder, and they all share leadership, so we just decided this would be very informal this evening. The purpose of this meeting is not only to go through some basic policies at the end of the meeting, but also in light of recent happenings in our school district to review policies and ensure the absolute safety of our students in many ways, as far as transportation, personnel, bullying, harassment, etc. So with that in mind, I want to share that we've got our 2 principals here with us. We've got our Director of Student Services, Technology and Assessment. We've got our Director of Finance and Operations. Nancy Krent, for those of you that do not know her, is on my left, so it'd be the audience right, is our consultant for this evening and will be asking questions and answering questions. Her field of law specialty is in student issues and in discrimination, so that is great. And we have Kelly Bay, our curriculum leader, and Shelley Goff, my administrative assistant, that will be here to direct any public comment that occurs. And we just had another board member walk in, Philip Hood. So with that in mind, I will kind of set the tone for the meeting, and then I would ask our policy committee members to kind of take us from there, and we'll involve Nancy right away. We do have to, thank you Nancy, see she's already doing it. Do we have anybody that would like to have public comment? There's only one person out there that may. With that being said, we don't have any public comment now, but we may also have public comment throughout the meeting and at the end of the meeting as we work through our policies. With that in mind, the agenda is set up, and what we've decided to do is skip our routine review of policies until the end of our meeting. So I'm going to watch the time. At approximately 7:40 we're going to wrap up, if we have not already wrapped up, on our major discussion and go to our routine policies so we can adjourn at 8 o'clock this evening. So if you take a look at your packets, we are going to start with suggested policies for review, and that is in 2A. I did bring our district policy manual also in case we need to refer to that. And basically what I did with this is I went through the entire board policy manual and picked any and all policies that could even remotely have any connection with some of the doings in our district, as well as safety of kids. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to one of our policy committee members to get us started. Or with that, I could also have Nancy get it started because she's also reviewed those policies. What do you guys choose to do? Since this is informal this evening and we're eating pizza and salad,
I'll just make an observation and then pass it over to somebody else. Each of the policies standing alone makes sense. What I feel like I now am appreciating, having read them as a package, is that there are ways in which some of our responses, our investigation procedures, our enforcement phrases are slightly different amongst policies for different reasons. And it can be confusing to somebody whether they're reporting under the bullying policy and they go through that response plan, or they're reporting under the harassment policy, or perhaps the misconduct, the ethics policy. And so I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to have, and it looks like you have a procedure that's getting there, but for us to have a global incident reporting plan, and it could cover all of those things, but it could be very clear to parents if their student has a concern that might fall into any of these buckets. We don't make you decide which bucket. This is how you report, and these are the procedures we'll go through. And those procedures might differ depending on which bucket it falls into, which policy it falls into. but we'd have a single something we could roll out that pulls all of those enforcement procedures into a single, more reader-friendly kind of approach. So that's my overarching view. We sprinkle throughout these policies an enforcement provision there, an investigation provision there, and it felt like there's an opportunity for a single way of looking at investigations into anything a student might be concerned about vis-a-vis staff.
Okay, I want to take an even larger step back, a much bigger step back, and I want to start with a prefatory comment about how these policies came to be, just so anyone who's watching understands that, and just to make sure I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, we have subscribed to the press policy service, because I remember when I first got on the board looking through the policies and saying, this is kind of a mess. And the rationale was, and it's a good rationale, we have a service because there are so many legal updates that it is, we don't want to launch on our own and have all of our own policies, because then every time there's an update or a change, it's going to be hard to reconcile and recognize it. That was sound reasoning, and we've gone with that prototype. However, looking at all of these, especially with the mission in mind tonight, which is to really take a strong look at our student protection policies, it seems to me that the press has not served us, or indeed any school, very well in how these policies are put together. I think Susan's picked up on and well articulated one aspect of that, and that is that the reporting procedures aren't very clear. Much of it isn't clear. There's tremendous overlap, and at the same time you'll have a single policy that will touch on multiple different topics that are of interest to multiple different constituencies. It just doesn't do a good job, I don't think, of clearly articulating policy, but I continue to believe that we need to work within this framework to a certain extent.
Right.
So what I would propose is that we take a look, we work with the press policies here, but then we also, as a school district, come up with a couple policies that are outside of press that would represent best practices and all of the various student safety issues and reporting issues that are of concern to the school district, given particularly recent news events.
Do you want to say something before we go on?
I agree with what Julie and Susan have pointed out. I think when I look at these, one thing that I notice is that what we want to prohibit in order to keep students safe is not very clear, and it's described in different terms in different places.
Yeah.
So one word that concerns me that I see in a few places is the word inappropriate, which could only be, a figment of someone's thought process or imagination. That's not a standard that we can stand by. So I would like to see us define prohibited contact in a very concrete way that makes it very clear to people who are either working or volunteering at the school what is allowed and what's not. And also makes it very clear what we could be, if we are in the unfortunate position of having to discipline someone or take action to protect a student, that we're very clear on what we can do and what the limitations were.
I am going to have Nancy address some of your concerns. I do want to add one more layer and then go back and work through that. Our board policy, as Julie described, is through the Illinois Association of School Boards Press. And quarterly, we receive updates based upon all the new legislation changes. Lately, it's been things like as simple as grammatical errors or spelling out the word for rather than the number for. And while some of that has seemed kind of redundant in work, what I found is it's been a good exercise in having the board review more policies on a consistent basis. So the next thing we're doing is looking at all of our policies and make sure we review the policies at least once every 3 to 4 years. That's been the good exercise. Behind every one of these board policies are what we call administrative procedures. So the board sets the policy and the administrators actually set the procedures, and those are procedures that we would log into, that we follow, that we're really tweaking for our own uses. We will be adding our own forms, but we do have administrative procedures. Some of those procedures we're very comfortable sharing. Others of those procedures are not. There's strictly administrative procedures in order for us to enforce some of these policies. So, I think, Nancy, you've heard from the 3 policy committee members, and then I kind of gave a description on the administrative procedures. I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of start our conversation.
All right, thank you. And I think that all 3 of you have made really critical observations in terms of how we should go forward. It is true, and I've worked with press policies in many districts. Press puts out a policy really sort of for every law. Because, as Julie articulated, that's sort of how you can keep track. If this law changes, we know to go to that policy to update it. But we live in a society where we have many laws governing the same thing.
Right.
So we have state laws, and we have federal laws, and we have, in fact, multiple federal laws on some of these issues. And so you do get this sense that, well, why do we have a bullying policy, but separately we have a harassment policy?
Or hazing.
Or a hazing
reference, right?
Right, but hazing is a separate statute than the Illinois bullying statute. And the Illinois bullying statute is different than Title IX, which governs your sexual harassment, or Title VI, which governs harassment on the basis of, race or ethnicity. So you're right, at some level, we sort of need to keep them separate so we can find them and make sure that if there are different standards by the courts for different ones of these, that we've got them properly articulated. But it does, sure.
So a clarifying question, more for the camera, for people watching, because I'm sure people are bored on the answer. But could you explain the freedom to which the district has to add or subtract policy and that are not limited, or are we limited to what press provides?
You are not limited to what press provides, and indeed, in many situations, I'm sure you work with your own legal counsel to give you revised versions of what press does, and you are free to add additional policies. There are risks to doing that we can talk about as we go forward, which is that if you write a policy that is affected by a federal or state law, that policy may not be updated at the same time policies that change federal or state laws are updated, because press, for example, wouldn't know that you needed to have another policy updated. So it can be confusing. And sometimes a way to handle that is, rather than change policy, to come out with sort of a statement of purpose or a mission statement that may wrap some of this together. I do agree that asking families to decide, do I mean to file a bullying complaint, or do I mean to file a race discrimination complaint, or do I mean to file a harassment complaint, and how do I know, based only on what my student has told me, what the real underlying reason is for the other person's conduct? That's really, that's problematic, and I do think either having one form that tries to cover everything, or making sure that your administrators are trained to recognize that just because something is dropped in one bucket doesn't mean that you shouldn't say, I understand why you thought it was this, but now that I've started to investigate, I realize that it is really that, or it is this plus that, and we need to investigate both pieces of it. And I do think that that's an important piece for people to keep in mind. I don't know that you would necessarily require a policy that directs administrators to do that, but certainly it should be clear in the way they're trained that that's what they should do.
So it seems to me there's an opportunity here, and the risk is, as you point out, kind of competing edits that may go on for their. But I wonder if leaving the press policies, except where we just cannot tolerate them, leaving them more or less as they are, and either doing an additional policy or perhaps it's a procedure, which typically we're not involved with, but in this case I think we need to be, a procedure that is user-friendly, is published to the public, is helpful for pulling all these pieces together for the people. As I was thinking about it for the parents and the children, as I was thinking about it, there might be a separate procedure, and we don't need to talk about that necessarily, but that is where staff feels as if they have been the victim, for lack of a better word, of misconduct, either by the public or by other staff or by administration or by parents. That also is scattered through here in various places, and perhaps that's a second procedure that we publish. And it's not really the same issue that we're talking about today, but it dawned on me that being really transparent about that student procedure and making it as easy as possible, and I think we even have an anonymous complaint process, making it as easy
There's
as
a copy.
possible
You have
to
a
get into that. Yeah, I have it.
For the public, I just want to point out that it's on the middle school website, correct? It's called a harassment incident reporting form. It is anonymous. It goes straight to the principals and they investigate. So we do have this. There are copies of that at all your seats so that you can see what it looks
And
like.
so the start of what I would say we need to do there is call it something broader, not harassment incident form, but incident form, incident complaint form, or something broader.
Yeah, let me suggest maybe that we try to put some structure around what we're going to try to accomplish here tonight. What I walked into here today thinking that our paramount goal was to come up with a policy and make sure we had the right components of a policy to protect students from teacher misconduct. That was what I regarded as our highest and first priority. So, I see sort of there's policy that says you cannot do this, don't do this. Here's what we permit and don't permit. And then there's procedure for reporting and investigation. And maybe we separate those two out and deal with one and then the other.
Yes.
When I think about dealing with the first part of it, I think I see, the kind of language and the beginnings of this policy in our ethics and conduct, which is 512, and our harassment of students, which is 720. That's where I see the bulk of what I'd like to see be part of this policy. And then it's, as you say, scatter, it's a good word. There's other components that might flow into it. But what I'd like to do, and what I don't think would be a problem or too much at odds with press, is pull this out of here or duplicate it if we have to, what's in general personnel and what's in the student harassment, and come up with this, here is what teachers cannot do vis-a-vis students, or what they can and can't do. And that would be, for example, in the ethics and conduct is where you see, they can't engage in any social activity or have a social relationship without notifying the school. They can't socialize outside of class time for reasons unrelated to an appropriate purpose. They can't provide alcohol. I would add to that pornography. That's where I think we see the most of what this policy would be. And it's fine to have it as part of ethics and conduct, but I think we need a more pointed policy on student interaction with students.
I think that there are a couple of things, though. I'm not opposed to doing that, but I think there are a couple of things that we could come up with as sort of standard language that could be threaded through all of these that would be pretty simple to do. For just as an example, any place we have a comment on staff or teacher interaction with kids through any kind of electronic means, it should say that it should only originate in a school device, and it should only terminate where it's in a situation that's supervised by parents. In other words, you can't send private text messages from your own computer or your own telephone, and you can't send messages to students unless you copy their parents.
Right, I agree with that.
Or in the case of the middle school, there's kind of an internal email system, but that's supervised, and that would meet my criteria also. And I think that's pretty easy to define.
Right. Again, we're talking about what goes in this policy. My suggestion, first order, can we decide that we are going to, rather than having a piecemeal here and there, have a policy that says here's what's appropriate student-teacher interaction, and that would address socializing outside. It would address electronic communication. It would address photographing them. It would address providing them with alcohol. All of those things and sexual harassment, which now is a separate policy that applies both to coworker harassment and student-teacher harassment with standards that I would suggest may be appropriate for coworkers, but are absolutely not strong enough for teacher-student
Right.
So that's what I'd like, that's what I'd like to do, and then spend the rest of this time maybe talking about the different components that go in that policy.
Can I ask whether you want to write if you want to write a policy that takes pieces of different policies and put them together?
Yes.
Could you accomplish that? And again, this is to think about what happens if press updates one or the other, and the language that we've now pulled from one has been changed. Could you write a policy that says something along the lines of all staff shall receive, say, yearly in-service training on these following policies, because these represent our our concerns or our requirements with regard to staff student conduct. So you have either a policy statement or simply a determination on training. I think there is a policy actually on training that requires that each of those be the subject of training. And I think either works or both work together. Again, one concern about pulling language from different places is if legal standards change, will someone be charged with the obligation to go back into each of those component policies and then make sure that the overarching policy is changed to reflect the same?
I think we can accomplish that. I do think you can, again, if we want to make it duplicative and then you footnote in certain policies, also see this policy and then this, it just seems to me, that's a good idea, I like that. I don't think it solves the problem of we don't ever articulate in an overarching way and a comprehensive way what all of our prohibitions and things are.
I would think that we would go through the policies that we have, strengthen the language, amend, do whatever we're going to do to them, and then create what you're talking about, if we still think that that's something we need to do. Because the problem, I don't think we can only do what you're talking about, because then all of these also address some other elements than just child safety.
And that's what troubles me about them. So we've got ethics and conduct. You've got, it starts off with the social appropriate boundaries, then it goes to an ethics and gifts ban. Then it goes to outside employment. Then it goes back to interaction with students. It's just, I mean, it's just a matter of, maybe it's the lawyer and me just saying this is not a good way to communicate with people.
Well, when I was reading this, I was having a very hard time not just starting over.
Right.
But
We're not doing that, right? Please tell me we're not doing that.
But just so you're aware, and for people who are watching at home, this is the board policy 5:120. All these separate things are in there because there is an Illinois requirement that teachers are bound by what's known as the Code of Ethics for Illinois Educators. So the Code of Ethics for Illinois Educators covers all of these topics, and so when the policy was written to make sure that boards adopted that code as a policy, it made sense to put them in one policy so that if the Code of Ethics is changed, which appears in the regulations, that's why it's there. And I understand the confusion. It is difficult, and that's why you have this policy, and as you say, a lot of this language also appears, especially the language about student contact appears in other places as well.
Right.
Can I have
So-
an observation? I'm not on the policy committee, and I apologize, but I'm an observation.
It's all right.
I think I really like Julie's idea, but I want another lens through which to view it. And I think it might be meaningful to people not in education to be able to very easily go to one place in our policy manual and see something happened to my son,
Teacher-student
and I wonder
relationship.
if it falls if there's an easy way to go down a list and say, oh yeah, that's exactly what happened.
don't we
All
want,
the
And that
ways
could
for them to
cross-reference these other policies,
Yeah,
so
then
that when one of
also
them
see
gets
this
an
as this.
update,
But
by
I think
press.
maybe viewing it through the lens of somebody else not in academics might be an argument for such a summary policy.
So I'm gonna think outside the box and think very simply, because I would be the one, and any superintendent in charge of policy is gonna be the one that has to make sure the cross references when things change, that it gets to the board. So why wouldn't we, in my mind, pick out the paragraphs of the board policies that you want in one place, and at the top of the new policy, you put in any changes to this policy, you have to cross-reference that with the other policy. And it has to be up at the top. When you put it in footnote, Julie, it gets lost.
True.
So it would even have to be like right under the Lake Bluff Elementary School District 65. All the cross references would have to be up there. So that when you have someone like a Shelley who works with me on board policy, she'd say, just so you know, this is in press, so you gotta automatically pull this policy XYZ
Right.
because that's the one that's in there.
I mean, as I'm listening, that's good. I think we can work where we can, deal with the updates and also have a good comprehensive standalone policy. I don't want the bureaucracy of press and the rest of it to make us feel like we can't come up with a good policy to protect our kids, because right now I feel like we just don't have it clearly set forth, comprehensively set forth. And even things that may, it's all about the legal, we may want to transcend the legal. We may want to go in and put in things that just seem prudent to us that may not be, within the, not violating the law, but also not dictated by the law. So yes, what I think we should do is go through these policies now, figure out what components we want it would be part, reflect what this student-teacher interaction policy will be, and start to, indicate those, decide how we want to supplement them, and then work on the policy from there.
And one way to do that simply is simply to say, this is policy, whatever number. It is a compendium of the following policies, and then simply take paragraph 3 from 2105 and paragraph 7 from, and maybe not even have a separate policy, simply have a policy that just holds chunks of these other policies, so that you have one
So it's all
policy
in one place.
in one place,
Yeah, that's
and that may be easy, or it may not solve your problem. You may decide, here's where we're going to add additional language as well. But I
Based
think
upon what we find in the policy that we're reviewing.
and whether that solves what you need.
okay. Well, let's.
So let's start with 2.105. In this policy XYZ on student safety, what are the pieces? I'm gonna start out by telling you that, 40? Yeah, I'm on page 40. And in this particular policy, I saw nothing that we would probably want to put in this, but it was something, with the stretch, there could be things in here. I didn't see anything in this one.
No, I didn't
No.
either.
All right, so we'll say no to that. So then the next policy is, and I put this in 2.230 because I wanted to remind everyone and also the audience that the board has been really good. Since I've been here, we moved from one public speaking at the beginning of a meeting to the beginning and the end. But this is the policy that refers to that. Again, nothing to do with student safety, so nothing in that one.
And do you want feedback about these that doesn't pertain to student
No.
safety? Okay.
The feedback we're gonna need are the ones in the very beginning that we have to go back to later.
We have a practice of asking people not to talk about individual students or staff
Right.
that should be in this that I didn't see.
Ah. You've got that too, Shelley? So they can't, when they're having a public comment, they can't say individual student names or staff names.
There's a line that Mark does about
Yeah.
ask us for private.
It
or
actually
something like that.
came from the Illinois Association of School Boards, so that's something we'll take a look at. Uniform grievance procedure. I see this more going along with Susan's idea of looking at the procedure.
Right.
Any other feedback on that one?
This is one that I would recommend that you not make any changes to without consulting your lawyers, because this was designed to make sure that you are in compliance with a variety of laws, the ones that are listed in the policy. Make sure that you're complying with what various federal agencies believe is appropriate for the investigation into those, which is why most of your complaint management for all sorts of complaints follows the same process, because this is generally what courts have said satisfies, or an agency has said, if you do this, this satisfies our requirements that you've investigated fairly. Now, that you can add or change that, but you'd want to consult with your lawyers to make sure that you've got that done right.
So is it fair to say that we should base if we come up with a one general like incident report, some of the procedures would be based on this policy then?
If you're only going to do one kind of investigation, you want to make sure that you're complying with this.
No, I'm not saying one kind of investigation. I'm saying one kind of report for the
To
parents.
be broken up, so
For
parents
the
don't have to
kids, so they
decide.
don't have to thumb through this to figure out if there's a violation. I have a concern about how my child was treated. I don't know if it violates anything. I have a concern, right? And we may look at the concern and decide it doesn't violate anything and let them know that. But it's the intake procedure, I think we need to be more clear about.
Making it more user-friendly and clear for parents.
Easy.
Okay.
Right, for students.
The only thing I would say is, Shelley, on this one, page 47, our address needs to change for the complaint managers. So the next one is chain of command. Not really sure why I put that in there. It might have been behind another policy, but I don't think there's anything that relates to that. 5.20, workplace harassment prohibited.
So did you skip 4.110? I just had some typos. I don't know.
I don't have that one in here.
That was added later. It was
Oh,
right here.
I don't have that in my policy packet.
Pardon me?
Oh.
Did you maybe in that version you corrected that? No typo.
When I read this policy, I thought
I don't have it.
it's clear to me that this is about workplace issues, but it might not be clear to someone else who was reading the policy from. Oh, we're talking about workplace.
We went back to 4.110, which was in
sorry.
a small packet in front of you. It's on transportation. And the reason I pulled this one, and I may be asking Jay to elaborate, and it really is a good example of drawing your line in the sand and being too specific. One of the things that we feel pretty strongly about is reviewing every single one of our bus stops and making sure that our kids are not on a bus stop within, is it 500 feet of a registered sex offender? It is not required by law to do that. In fact, it is the registered sex offender's responsibility to do that. And we do it on a regular basis. This year, when we made the calls, and it was actually to one of our board members lives in the vicinity of this, the neighbors were adamant that they wanted the bus stop to stay in that area because it better allowed the parents to be able to really monitor the kids. So if our transportation policy had said something to the extent of there will be no stops within 500 feet of a registered sex offender, we wouldn't have been allowed to honor those parents' wishes.
And
So
the law is actually 500, sex offenders need to stay 500 feet away from schools or parks, but 100 feet from bus stops. So we're even more rigorous than that.
But again, this came up at one of our meetings for student safety, and that's why it was pulled. I don't know if you wanted to take a part out in here on that and put that in this policy XYZ.
So policy XYZ. Oh, go ahead.
You need to come up to the mic though.
Mr. Hood.
Just stay here.
My debut. Now, I think one thing on transportation that should be looked at, and I don't know where it would fall, is the use of technology by students on the bus. It seemed pretty clear in the presentation that was given, and actually just hearing from my own student, that if there are risks to technology that's not being monitored, that's maybe perhaps owned by the student, that's kind of a time that's not monitored by any adult. There's only one adult on the bus, that's the driver, and so I'm thinking while we're on transportation, if there's any student-based policy that is pretty explicit about use of technology on buses and inappropriate use of technology. That's my only point here.
buses
Okay,
are covered
again,
as
what
property.
policy are we talking about? 5.2?
It's 4.110, and there was a sheet on, it should be underneath that.
Yeah, I would.
The very first line has a word I've never heard of before. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that.
Yes, that caught my attention too.
You don't know what that means?
Google doesn't either.
In the district.
That's funny.
In the Dion.
I don't know. It's supposed to be district.
One thing that I noticed that comes up in several of our policies is it says that down toward the bottom, all contracts for charter bus services must contain a clause, blah, 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 regarding criminal background checks for bus drivers. And we have criminal background checks listed in our manual and other places, but we have no requirement for what we're going to do about them or what we're looking for.
Do you want to address that piece? Criminal background checks? Because in the state of Illinois, it's my understanding that we all do national background checks. I'm assuming that transportation companies do that too.
Yeah, who
Yeah,
knows? They
well,
could be doing anything. Do they do a fingerprint? Do they just send in a name? Do they get a social security number? And if they get a hit, what kinds of hits are they screening people out for? Drug offenses? Do we want drug DUI people? Do we want to limit people that have sex offenses? Shoplift? I mean, there's nothing here about what they should do with that. They can hire anybody. Yeah, we did the background check. We were cool with it.
That presumably,
To illustrate the point.
that presumably is in your contract with your transportation.
That we have, they would need to notify us and we would just make the determination based on the result.
So
But
it is in
again-
the contract.
Okay, but that they notify us and we make a determination, again, doesn't describe or limit anything we would do.
No, they would need to meet the same standards that we would be required to meet. So if we were hiring someone, there are certain standards when we run the background check. And all employees of contractors need to meet those same standards.
And are those standards explicit? Are they written down? Like you could bring them in and show us what the practice is? No.
I don't know the statute.
I'm not criticizing you, I'm just making the point. We say we're gonna do background
So,
checks, but we don't say what we're gonna do with it.
Jay, if you could do me a favor for your report next week, just bring in whatever language the bus company uses for that. My vote with this one is that in this policy XYZ, that's what I'm calling it right now, we put in something about criminal background checks for bus drivers, and we put in something about checking bus stops to ensure they're not within 500 feet, but keeping the language loose enough that based upon the phone calls we have with parents, we can work with the parents.
You know, my vision for what we're now calling policy ABC, whatever we're calling it, is really that it's teacher-student interaction.
So in this case, you would offer to tighten this policy up.
Right, I keep
Okay.
this content here and
All right.
tighten it up.
So we'll tighten this one up and we'll bring it to the next meeting.
What is here is, that needs to go into XYZ or teacher-student interaction policy is no school employee may transport students in school or private vehicles unless authorized by the administration. That does belong in the teacher-student interaction policy.
Got that, Shelley? And actually, Jay would tell you that because we're not covered liability-wise when we put students in our car either, in most
So
cases.
maybe we're talking about teacher-student interaction policy and or statement, and also a protection of students statement. Here is maybe a list of all of the things like the criminal background checks that you were starting to list is a different kind of policy.
I think we can do that within tightening up the policy.
Oh, I see.
For your
Okay.
purposes, I think
That's
policy
fine.
XYZ should have the student teacher.
Okay.
All right, flipping to.
Wait, Susan's line that should be included,
Yeah.
is there a loophole that says that, but teachers can transport students on public transportation, bus or train?
That would be assumed.
I don't want to assume anything.
This says their own vehicle.
I know, no school
Right,
employee
school
that transports
or-
in a school or private.
It just says unless authorized by the administration.
I think you're making the point they can't take the students on the train, but I think that concept is going to be covered by no inappropriate socializing with the students, or maybe. But let's check. So that's a good point.
Got it. All right, 5.20.
Here we get to it.
it looks to me like you would like the paragraph on sexual harassment prohibited, that paragraph.
Well, wait a minute, because now when I look at this, I think the concept actually is in a different policy. This seems to be speaking to coworker harassment, not student harassment. There is a
Right.
separate policy
That's right.
that we're going to come to, 7.2, that is student harassment. So I don't think there's anything in this one that we need to.
I see your,
Couldn't there in this one
Okay.
be a line of something saying this policy pertains to interactions among staff for information about teacher-student or staff-student relationships, please refer to. So if somebody from outside is
I wouldn't
looking
have
at
a
it.
problem. Section 5 is all on employment and staff
Right, section,
in the policy manual.
right, section
But-
7 is identified as the section on students. You could add it, but I'm not sure that, I don't know that anyone would be looking here from the outside in the first place, because if you go to the manual titles, this, I don't think is where you would go.
Just to be devil's advocate though, would you want some reference to this because our teachers are role models for our students and we would not want them to observe such behavior in the workplace?
I think that's too attenuated. I wouldn't tinker with this workplace policy.
This policy I know meets the requirements of, you can confer with your legal counsel, because I'm not here to give you legal advice, just to give you policy advice, but this is a pretty standard Title VII employment discrimination policy. I'd be concerned about mucking around with it too much.
No, I wasn't talking
Yeah.
about monkeying around with this,
Okay.
but on our new policy, XYZ, ABC, whatever we're calling it, some reference. I'm not pushing hard on this. I'm
We're
just-
lifting paragraphs though, so that they're interchangeable. So that way we can keep up with the
We
policy.
do make a reference to harassment of students prohibited policy in the first paragraph, at the very end of the first paragraph here. So to
Oh, you're right.
the point about,
That's
this
what-
isn't the one that deals with
Isn't that
that,
what you
it's
said?
there.
That
End
is
of
there.
the first sentence.
Okay.
All right, but speaking to Mark's point, in policy 5120, which we're going to come to shortly, there is a duty to report provision. So that does address if staff members see something that's inappropriate, what they're supposed to do.
So I was sort of thinking the other way around. If a student sees something inappropriate by staff member, that kind of role modeling behavior that you don't want to have. I don't know how you would include that. It occurred to me as we were talking about it.
Maybe it's part of the interaction, this teacher-student interaction. I don't know.
Well, but after we've gone through the policies, that's something we're gonna have to go back and revisit to make sure we have everything in there. Shelley, on that last one, 5.20, addresses have to be changed again, so. 5.30, I put in hiring process on criteria because it had been brought up in one of our meetings by one of our people that addressed the board. And I have to go back and look, but I think this may be the issue that was brought up before about background checks and what kind. So I'm looking to see,
The superintendent shall ensure that a fingerprinted base background check and a check of the statewide sex offender database is performed on each applicant as required by state law.
right. And we do that, and I would even be comfortable in saying the superintendent or designee shall ensure that a fingerprint-based national criminal history, because it's not just state,
Yeah.
it looks into national also.
That sounds good. Yeah, statewide sex offender does not seem to be sufficient at all.
But it doesn't, we do a national fingerprint criminal history and only a statewide sex offender.
I don't know, someone would have to look into whether or not there is a nationwide
There isn't.
sex offender database. I think
There
that's
isn't.
why it says statewide,
There isn't one.
because
I think you can pay for that kind of a check to be done though, and the company that does it will go check whatever states you tell them to check.
Let's look into that.
I mean, you could, for example, you could check, you could do a regional one where they'll check Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, or you can have them check states where the person claims to have been employed
Jay?
previously.
That will be Jenny's job tomorrow. So could you talk to her about that? She needs to check to see if there's a nationwide sex offender database. And if so, kind of give us the details on it.
And to answer Leanne's question, the statute actually is very specific about offenses. It enumerates all the offenses that if they're found on the background check that you can't hire someone.
Yeah, any background check, because I had to review those also for all the construction people in the summer. And they will print out the charges, so you have to make a decision. Like if there was grand theft auto in 1964, I had that once for a bus.
Right. Well,
clerical.
I mean, this is actually, so it says the time period, it can't be within so many years, and it can't be this list of offenses. And then beyond that, you could, still at your discretion whether you want to hire somebody, but you're prohibited from hiring anyone who meets the criteria that's laid out in the statute.
And that stuff is laid out in statute, but not in our policy.
The policy refers to the statute.
The policy refers
Yeah.
to statute.
Okay, so in this hiring process, here's what's not in here that I'd like to discuss, whether it can be in here, should be in here, whatever. Do we conduct and require reference checks?
Yes, we do.
Okay, I don't see that in here. I don't know if you said there's some special, other procedure policies you have, but that would be something that I'd like to see written down that is part of our hiring process, that we will personally, somebody from our district call, the
How
references
many
that are given.
references do you guys check? How many did I tell you, 2 or 3?
3 minimum. Sorry, 3 minimum.
And we fill out that recommendation for hire form, which I know goes to the district office. I don't know if that's included in board.
No, it's not in board
How do we
policy.
generate who we call on references?
We do things officially and unofficially. The official is the references that are listed on their form. The unofficial is the majority of us know people in other communities, and I mean, it goes without saying that if we see that, Susan, you're from Palatine District 15, I'm gonna call Palatine District 15. I used to work there, and
Yeah.
you know the Susan Ryder.
Yeah.
But what I also, again, I don't do this, you do it, you tell me if it's practical, but I would hope that we would be able to call even a district where we didn't have a contact and
That's
try
what
and
I'm
get
saying.
the backdoor information. Well, I heard you say because you worked at Palatine, you called Palatine, but do you also call, La Jolla, California, even though you didn't?
Here's what happens with that, and it is practical and it isn't practical. It's very obvious on some resumes when you're interviewing that maybe they didn't list a reference for a district they spent 3 years in. Usually we'll call on something like that. So I would say yes and no. It just depends on the references that are provided to us, the references of people that we know and check, and then if we see any gaps on their resume or on their application.
And should policy spell out those kinds of specific steps?
That's procedures.
Right, I want
I'm
to talk
really
again
hesitant
about
about
the
that.
difference between policy and procedure. I think having a policy that references will be called is a good policy. I think that if you start saying it should be 3 and you need to make sure you speak with someone at this level, and then what do you do if this is someone's first job and how do you want to check those references and which people should be called, or what do you do if someone worked in a district where the policy is only to give, neutral information. I wouldn't put all that in this policy. I think it's the point of having policy and procedure, the point of having professionals running the day-to-day operation of your school district is because they're the people whose job it is to hire these people and to come to you with the recommendation to hire. And so I think you want to have people who know, all right, this is the basic requirement. Our main concern, this is going to be, you have your mission statement and talk about safety there. And here's our policy on hiring, and it talks about, and we're going to add something about reference checks. But I think beyond that, you have to decide whether or not you trust your administrators, and that's where you need to put your trust in making sure that these policies get implemented.
I think we do, and I think we all are very clear on the difference between a policy and a procedure. And I also think that this is coming up in conversation because of some events that have happened. So we just want to uncover that a little bit to say, okay, so references happen. What about that needs to be included in the policy, if anything? And what do you do with that? Because it looks, if you read the newspaper, like schools are hiring people where they either checked references, gotten information that wasn't satisfactory and moved ahead anyway, or they didn't check reference. So that's why
At all,
we're sort
at
of
all.
checking this out.
I would tend to agree with everything that's been said. I'd also circle back to something Susan said at the very beginning about this may be a case, however, where procedure maybe should be opened up a little bit. And I don't know that we have our procedures available publicly on the
They're
internet.
not and they won't be.
Why is that?
They won't be because oftentimes we don't want those procedures available because of the fact that we're changing them on a repeated basis. It would be a nightmare for us to try to keep up with that.
This may be different.
There may be certain procedures,
Yeah.
but you know, these are things that we as administrators have to do to enforce things, and not all of that are things that I want to share publicly.
No
You know, I
one's
equate-
suggesting all of it, but I think
There may be exceptions.
There may be exceptions. I mean, something like this is neutral. It would be not a big deal for us to cover it. But I'm certainly not going to get into, you know, we check 3 references and then we look for gaps on your resume and then we call those people, and it gets into things that I wouldn't want to spell out in the procedure.
I can appreciate what you're saying, but I also think that there's reason, and I'm not going to argue hard to do exactly what you don't want to do, but I am going to make the point that there are community members who would take great solace in having a better understanding of what we specifically do to prevent these kinds of things from ever happening again.
Can I make a suggestion? Because I think this is really important, and I'm hearing a lot from all of you about your concerns, which I think, especially given your recent history, are completely justified, about making sure that your community really understands this. The hard truth is, when people want to understand it, going to your policy manual and reading through it to figure it out is a really hard thing to do. I'm wondering whether it might be helpful in addition to this work, and Mark specifically to address those kinds of concerns, might be, and Dr. Sophie and I have discussed this, holding a community forum where you walk through on the issue of student safety. Let's talk a little bit. Here's a presentation about what we do when we hire. Let's talk about this new policy XYZ that we've put together, but we want you to know it's not, this isn't this XYZ policy. All those pieces were already here and we were doing them, and here's how we're making it better, and here's how we're rolling out whatever the new incident reporting form is going to look like. That might be, obviously it goes beyond what your committee's doing, but it might help address issues of communicating to the public rather than in addition to just changing policy language.
We can certainly consider that. Let's talk about this policy though, because I hear what you're saying. I agree with you. I don't like policies that are very prescriptive. I think that ties your hand. I don't like it. I find it ironic because so many of these are, and I've been complaining about them for years, but okay, on this one we're not going to get into great detail. I think this one is deficient as written because it doesn't say that references will be checked, and it doesn't say that social media will be checked. And you know, I agree with you that maybe the detail of that stays out, but I think we need to speak to it in this policy. Because then I hear things like, well, we can't do it because it's not in our policy. I don't want to hear that. I want it to be here enough to convey it, and then I'll trust our administrators to, you know, really probe on who we hire.
So I'm making a list of things that go in XYZ, teacher-student interaction, XYZ policy, and then I really do think a summary of all of the student safety measures that we're identifying as we go through these policies. And then maybe it's nothing more than a communication, but we have got a whole bunch of them living in a whole bunch of different documents. And so I'm thinking of it as 2 lists, right? What governs our student-teacher interactions? That's one list, that's primary. But then background checks, references, social media checks, you know, independently developed references, a requirement that we don't just take their references, but we develop our own. All of that is a student safety measure that goes into the second list. So, and I think a forum makes sense, but I think they need to be able to lead with something. You know, we have these 2 lists.
It might be the end result of our policy work.
Right.
And a couple of the procedures, like you and Mark have said, that lay out specifics and alignment of other things associated with safety. So what I have down for this one is it will not go into XYZ, but it needs to be rewritten, especially under the paragraph under investigations. We need to do a check on the National Sex Offender Database if there is one.
There is
We
one.
need to.
It's the FBI has one that pulls from all of the state and territory and Indian tribe registries.
So we need to check into that and find out the cost.
It's public searchable criminal.
I think, yeah, I bet.
Oh, she does that, all right? Well, then we need to list that because I didn't even know we did
It's
that.
called the National Sex Offender Public Website, coordinated by the Department of Justice.
All right, so that needs to be listed. I've got reference checks, social media checks, independently developed reference checks.
Right, good.
All right,
I'm going to advise you to speak with your legal counsel about how you want to word the issue of social media.
she's
That's
gonna,
gonna-
she's
that's
gonna
gonna-
write it.
That's a significant issue.
Yeah, we're not gonna require passwords.
Right, no, you can certainly Google the person. and see what you
Terry
come up with.
will have to write this for us. She knows that, so. All right, 5.90. DCFS.
One thing that stood out on this to me is that we asked for people to have completed their mandated reporter training within a year of initial employment. The way that's worded, I'm guessing that's a legal requirement, but I wonder if we couldn't make that something that we require to be done sooner than the legal requirement, like 30 days or 60 days.
Did we have to bargain that with our teachers?
What's the question?
The question is whether, the board policy says that they have to have their mandatory DCFS reporting training within a year of being hired, and Leanne's asking why we couldn't mandate that in a 30-day time period.
I don't know why the union would object. I
It's
think you
not that they
notify
would
them.
object.
I think you notify them, and if they want to bargain over it, I can't imagine.
I consult with Terry about whether or not that's.
Yeah, I think that it's gonna be bargained.
You might, as you get to the end of this, have a list of 2 or 3 things that you need to address with them. The reason it might be bargainable would be because if someone doesn't complete the training, they'll lose their employment. And
But
it's
they-
not what's
but
required
it's-
right now.
It's on us to offer it, or no, they have to go
It's
out and
on,
get it.
no, it's on us. Kevin's in charge of all that. He does
Yeah,
all
it's on
that.
us to offer it, so we can't hold it against them if they don't.
And right now, we require it by December 31st.
Right. So they start in August, it's required by December 31st.
So it's already not a year, but maybe our
It's already
policy
not a
could
year.
reflect what we do.
It could be within 30 days unless something happens that prevents it. You know, I think.
I mean, my point is
You
I
could tighten
can't
it
really
up.
hold people accountable for that requirement until they've taken the training, right? So you want to have everybody.
No, that wouldn't be accurate. They actually have to sign something when they are employed saying that they acknowledge that there is a law and that they understand the law, and then there is biannual training that they have to go through.
What about during orientation? Was there any reason why we can't do this during orientation?
We
The
could,
training?
along with the 150
50
other
other
things
things?
we've gotta do in 2 hours' time.
2?
I'm just,
I thought it was 2 days,
the
but
list is a mile long because we have, I mean, literally, we can barely get done what we need to get done in those days. So if this is gonna be a priority, because I agree with Kevin, they have to sign mandated reporter forms when they're hired. So they need to be held responsible for it, but they haven't had the training.
Yeah.
That's their
This is not something that if you were looking to hold something over somebody's head, this would not be an area that you couldn't do that. They sign something when they're employed that says that they acknowledge that it's there,
That's
that
fine.
they're a mandated
I've
reporter.
seen lots of, unemployment hearings and different, grievances, and I just think it could only help us to have people who have their training done.
All right, so what are we gonna do with this one? We need to have the policy reflects what we do.
How about on that last paragraph on page, before it, ethics and conduct statement, so it's the last paragraph of the abuse and what about school board reporting? It only says if we learned about it during closed or open session. What if somebody tells me on the street that something's going on? Should we include something that we're required to report it no matter what?
No.
I don't know about that.
No, I don't think so. Because I don't know if they're speaking to me as, you know, a person in the community, a fellow mom, or as a board member, or I just think that creates too much ambiguity.
Well, wait a minute, though, if I'm in Target and I see a parent hitting the kid, do I have an obligation? I'm asking, do I have an obligation as a school board member if I observe it?
No, then that's what I'm trying to prevent being created here.
Okay, the answer is no. I mean, I'm asking.
But Mark, in a question mark with that, it says that you direct or cause the board to direct the superintendent and or his designee
Right.
to go ahead, and that's what any of you would do. If
But
you
it only talks about the specific case during an open or closed board meeting.
That's
So I think what that's saying is that a board member is not a mandated reporter,
Okay,
other than information
Board
that would come up
business.
in a board meeting.
I see, okay, so that
So if
answers
you
my
saw
Target
something
now.
in Target and
Answers-
you told a mandated reporter about it, a school staff person, or anybody who's mandated to report, then they would have to do that if they had enough information for the report.
That's what Nancy said too. That is, as long as, if it's board business in open or closed session, then you're a mandated reporter. If you see something outside of that, I would certainly hope that you would, you know, tell us if
But
it
then
were one of
you're
our
a mandated
students, if you
reporter.
would even know that we're mandated reporters, we'd report.
Okay.
Okay,
Let me ask a very blunt, specific question here. It's current day.
Yep.
But there's a teacher in our district that somebody comes up to me, I'm walking down the street and says, I'm hearing stories that teacher ABC is having a relationship with a kid in the library, forcing them to watch pornography. What do I do?
You would tell me and we would have to launch an investigation.
And then why don't we say that in here?
This reflects what the law says. Now, when you are sitting in an open meeting or a closed meeting, you are functioning as the Board of Education. So this is now the school district.
But I'm
That's
always
why,
an
but
elected
when-
official.
But you are not, you don't act on behalf of the school district except when you're
As a group.
acting as a group or when you're directed by the board to do something. The other issue, of course, is enforceability, which is you don't have the authority to remove one of your fellow board members for violating something like this. You certainly hope that every board member takes student safety seriously and would in fact do that. And
So it's on me as an individual.
yes, because you're not functioning as the board when that person comes to you and tells you that thing. And you, looking at the chain of command policy that we just passed by, presumably you would be directing them to the appropriate person in the chain of command at that point.
But you're not a mandated reporter, if I'm reading this right.
That's correct.
You tell the superintendent that the superintendent, right, so, okay,
In that open and closed meeting situation.
right, and that's
So a
it.
board member can know about something like this and not
Not
have
say
any
anything.
requirement to say anything.
I'm really
Now,
uncomfortable with that.
So that's the law. Can the policy say anything different about that?
I mean, again, I would,
That's a Terry question, I think.
but, you know, in your mission statement or statement of purpose or your fundamental beliefs, certainly saying something that you believe that each of you has an obligation to protect the safety of children, including where appropriate, reporting these things. That's simply what most people
also
would
when
do.
you're old.
That's what almost every private citizen would do in such a situation. You could certainly say something like that.
You gotta remember, they're talking about the board. And while each of you is a board member, when you're not here in this room, you're not the board, you're individual board members.
I get the subtle semantic distinction. I understand that. I just think there's a higher purpose here.
There is, I would question, it's not even me, language on that for all of you. Because you all have personal lives and
Right.
I would worry about that for you. That's just my own advice, and I'm not even an attorney.
But couldn't we require ourselves to report such a thing to the superintendent, for example?
There may be concerns about legal liability for someone under the board policy. Would you want to have to be sued by someone individually, a
No.
third party, that you hadn't
No,
done
and-
that?
Yeah, and moreover, again, I don't know what the threshold is, but I'm not going to go around and scope out people in the library who I think are disciplining their kids and inappropriately and report it to. This is not the role I want to play. No.
No, but I think if you think to situations where a community becomes aware that there's something going on and where the ball has gotten dropped, perhaps.
Yeah. Again, maybe we footnote this, but a little asterisk for further discussion. I'd really like to move on to get to the teacher-student stuff because.
But I have one more point on this particular policy, and it has to do with teacher-student.
Okay.
The way that the vast majority of this reads is as if the teacher is becoming aware of abuse that's happening at home.
Right.
And I think that that's generally the intent of this, but. do
Not
you
always.
think- But, right, so, but it's not abundantly clear that that also covers abuse that's happening
In the school.
in the school. And maybe we don't change this policy at all, but instead we list it as
A resource.
part of the teacher-student interaction or safety measures, one of my two, big picture policies or statements.
So let me ask all of you guys this. Would you see this within the policy XYZ or on the list of other policies?
Tighten this one. And I think to the point you were raising, I do have a question about the very bottom of page 53, where it says the superintendent shall notify the state superintendent and regional superintendent in writing. There's reasonable cause to believe that a license holder, that's referring to the teachers, right, was dismissed or resigned from the district as a result of an act that made a child an abused or neglected child. I don't know what that means.
I can tell you because I've had to do that before.
Well, I know what it means you have to do, but what's the threshold for triggering that reporting obligation?
Anytime anybody is charged, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I had a paraprofessional in another district that was charged and found guilty of child abuse at home. And I had to call the regional superintendent and write a letter to the state superintendent because they really didn't belong in the school.
The threshold is the DCFS makes a finding. When there's a finding, you're required to report that
But this
to the
is
regional.
reasonable cause to believe, which I think is short of a finding, right?
It's reasonable cause to believe that the reason that they were dismissed or resigned, because you don't always, someone will say, I'm resigning for personal reasons. But there's supposed to be, it's supposed to be as a result of an act that made a child an abused or neglected child. The definition of when a child is an abused or neglected child is generally when there's a finding of such a thing.
And is that with regard to conduct in the home, or could that reach conduct in
Anywhere.
the school? Okay, so
Anywhere you abuse or neglect,
so my question.
anywhere you abuse or neglect a child, if you're covered by the act.
Okay, so would this require reporting in, say, for example, the Charles Ritt situation? Let's just put it out there. Call it what it is. Would Jean, if that situation were to happen here today, so there's a report, the guy's going to be investigated.
There was no DCF. The question is if there was a DCFS report and what DCFS finds.
But
Yeah,
are you asking
So
the
it's
threshold?
just if DCFS gets involved, is that the only, I guess.
Are you asking let me just make sure I understand. Are you asking the threshold question of if you found out information like that today, are mandated reporters required to call on that? The answer is yes.
So if
That's number one.
even if DCFS isn't involved in anything, but you have reason to believe that a teacher in your school, let's
Is
just talk about it
abusing-
completely in the hypothetical now.
Okay.
No,
Mm-hmm.
drawing comparisons. So you find, you have gotten some rumor that something's wrong,
Suspects
and
or
the
receives
teacher
knowledge.
understands.
Very low standard. It's in the first line.
Right.
What page you
Oh, wait,
guys
I
on?
think there's two. I'm sorry. I think there's two different pieces here,
Mhm.
and I want to make sure we keep them separate. The first question, and you're right, it's a very low standard, is when do you have to report to DCFS?
That's the low standard.
And that's the low standard. That's any
We
time
report
Yeah, I'm
any-
talking
you
about
suspect.
Okay.
If you even suspect, you call, and that's what the training is, and that's what they know even when they sign the letter saying, I understand what my obligation is even before I've gone with the training. That's up at the top.
Okay.
That's the first thing. At the bottom, when do we notify? When is the administration required to notify the regional superintendent and the state superintendent? That's at the end of the DCFS investigation. Generally, if there's been a finding, and we think that's why they left, or why they resigned, or we now know that it happened at home
That's
and
not
we
what
want
this
to.
language says. That's not what it says. It says if you have reasonable cause to believe that there was a resignation as the result of an act that made somebody abused or neglected.
Right.
So if you have reason to believe that your teacher just resigned because the teacher's gotten wind that now people are talking and he's going to be caught soon, does that trigger the obligation to report to the regional superintendent?
In my opinion, it does, but you would have to check. You have to know how. There's a high standard there, and I would check with your legal counsel because I think there are cases on this. But this is only when this is when you have reasonable cause to believe that that's why they left.
Right.
And that's what you need to know.
Right. Okay. Good. So we'll check with legal counsel. I forget.
We
that
will
that's
check
not
with
have
legal
your hiring
counsel.
here. Okay.
We need to make sure policy reflects what we do. And right now, I'm hearing that this would not go in policy XYZ, it would go on the other list.
Right. But Jean, I want to know if we can, what the standard is legally, and if we can have a different standard if we so choose, or if we can't. Probably we shouldn't, I suspect, but I'd like to know.
So, this goes to the earlier point that these policies are sort of hodgepodge. So the second paragraph here launches into hazing, which to me is very, very different than abuse and neglected reporting requirements. But here it says, is there a point to us pulling out something like this and calling it a hazing policy? Or I don't know, it just does not belong here.
No.
Yeah, I mean, did press put it here or did we?
I'm sure Press did it.
But is it in the, whatever. I'm going to try to make very few changes to press policy, but it seems like if hazing is important enough for us to mention it here, it doesn't belong in this policy.
No, I agree with you. Is hazing addressed elsewhere though? Maybe it's sufficiently covered elsewhere.
It's listed in the bullying. It's one of the types of bullying.
It's probably covered sufficiently there,
Anyway.
but I know. It's frustrating.
It's awkward, but if you take it out or make your own, then you've got a perpetual maintenance
I
problem,
know.
right? Because
I
anytime that
agree.
And you see legislation, then you're not.
If the hazing results in death or great bodily harm, the employee must first make a report to law enforcement. So I think that's how it fits in here, but anyway.
It may also fit in here because if you see something that, first of all, when you're talking about abuse and neglected child reporting, there are only certain categories of people who are covered by that. People such as parents or guardians, those kinds of teachers, staff members. There are only certain kinds of people whose conduct toward a child is classified as abuse or neglect. So someone who is hazing someone might not be covered. But when you think, oh my God, I just saw someone hurt that kid, or they left him out overnight as a hazing, and it was below freezing and all these terrible things, this might be a place where you would go look
Okay,
for
so
that.
that's the connection. Okay.
So even though they're legally distinct terms, in a broader sense, you could think of them being connected, I would think.
Right, and I think getting back to Susan's earlier point where you sort of want to keep together the things that people might instinctively look to when a certain kind of conduct is happening. That may be part of what their thinking was as well. I don't know for sure, but that to me would be why I'd want something referencing it in the same place.
Okay, one last point, and I know we're trying to move over this policy, but the second, right above the special superintendent responsibilities at the bottom of this page, it says the superintendent will encourage all district educators to complete continuing professional development that addresses the traits. Do we require it, or
Is that
do
a
we really just
requirement,
encourage
Karen?
it? I mean, it sounded sort of weak.
So it's under the Aaron's law, and I don't think that it is a requirement. It's a requirement for the social workers and the
Right,
people who are
certain
delivering
staff.
it. Yeah. So
I see. Well, something to think about. Maybe that's sufficient, but it seems like we could do more on training.
Keep in mind how many mandated modules do we have right now that teachers have to complete? About. Just about.
Traits and identifiers
6
that
to
may
7 a
be
year.
evident in students who are victims. Okay, because right above that, number 2, completed mandated reporter training as required by law within 1 year of initial employment and at least every 5 years. I guess that's the required training, every 5
Right.
years. And this other
We
training is
actually-
something in
We
addition?
do it more often.
We actually do it a lot more often than that because of the fact that it's a good reminder for staffing. We've had some issues with
So
it.
here's a fundamental question. Do we want our policy to be more tightly worded so that it reflects what we expect our standards to be? For example, by December 31st at the very latest. Within 30 days if possible, by December 31st at the very latest might be a language we would insert, or at least every other year on this paragraph 2.
I guess I can see it both ways, which is not going to be a good answer for you, but I hate to be boxed into deadlines because there's things that happen along the way that prevent us sometimes from meeting those things. And what we found with a lot of these policies is if and when we hear issues in other districts. This year, our district staff is very aware of the things going on in the district, so they know that training is going to result from that. But every time we mandate more training, something else has to be pushed by the side. And, it's just like our curriculum discussions we have. Whenever the state mandates more curriculum, the school day is still the same. School day is the same from when I was in school.
I understand, I'm not disputing that, but if we are expecting ourselves, we are expecting ourselves to do it every other year. The only way the board influences policy is to put it in policy, not to, and hire a great superintendent and great principals, of course, who make these things happen. But our standard is here.
But, let's say something else serious happened out of this whole policy packet.
Okay.
And
let's asterisk it.
I would asterisk, but I would tell you that we go kind of along with, when there's issues in districts, that's when we move up some training and maybe put behind another year of training based upon what we're seeing issues with. Obviously with the Jesse Weinberger presentation, we're going to be doing more training on the technology piece because there were a lot of issues that came out of that. So if we had every other year for this policy, we might have to make a choice, and when it's set to every other year, you have to decide as a board if that's important enough for us to do every other year.
So let me propose something else. Maybe in the student safety measures summary document, whatever we're calling it, policy, we say that some type of training, it may not be mandatory,
Absolutely, we do that
some
anyway.
type of training on student safety
Every year.
will be done every year. That seems like a reasonable expectation, right? And we're doing it anyway, and it
That's reasonable, don't you guys
demonstrates
think, for
to
principals?
it
Every year
demonstrates
we
to
do.
the community
You guys know
that
we
we
do
take
that
it
anyway.
seriously.
Yep.
And we could word it in a way that it's flexible enough to cover a variety of things. Mandatory reporter training would be one, but there'd be other ways.
Yes,
Okay. Student safety, teacher, professional staff gets trained
I would
every year
defer
on
to the judgment of the administration on this point. And if they don't think they need this prescribed, I wouldn't prescribe it on the training. I think ample training is done. I think they do it, that would be my judgment. That
We
being
could
said, if you're
certainly
telling me to do
list
it anyway, it becomes circular. Who cares?
we could list it for student safety measures. We'll list something on that.
Okay.
I think when you look at 5.120,
Yeah.
the entire
Okay.
section on page 2 of 3 for prohibited conduct, I think would go on our policy.
Yes, and I think it needs to be embellished, and that's why I'd like to take advantage of having the principals here to see if they have ideas on how this can be embellished. The obvious embellishment to me is that you would add in providing students with sexual images. Again, I understand you have to be careful to the extent that there's sex ed taught and things like that. So R-rated material, I don't know, whatever it is that doesn't have a legitimate educational
appeals
purpose.
to the purient interest.
Right. And this is where I think also we add in Leanne's point about all communication has to be through, the district provided device. But I'm wondering if there are things that you have seen, situations you've encountered where you think, ooh, we should cover this somewhere, this isn't something that should be happening. And silence is reassuring.
Sorry,
I'm glad
yeah,
there's nothing's
look,
popping to mind, but
yeah.
it's,
as I'm just reviewing the prohibited conduct here.
Yeah, and for the record, I mean, well, while you're looking at that, this would, for anyone who's watching, this prohibits engaging in romantic or sexual relationships and any communication along those lines, emotional or socially intimate relationships, communications for any inappropriate reasons, socializing outside of class time for inappropriate or unrelated reasons, providing alcohol to students or drugs. So that's what's in there, which is obviously very good.
And importantly, under the reporting procedures, staff are required to report even a suspicion of an improper relationship. Not even if they have knowledge, but even suspicion of an improper relationship. I think that's an important piece. That's right there under report. It's just under prohibited conduct. It says reporting. It says reporting procedures, duty to report. That's on page 56. Here, I can share it.
Right.
This is one of the places where I wanted us to look at language in regards to appropriate and inappropriate also. So in letter B, participating in inappropriate emotionally or socially intimate relationships, I would just take out inappropriate. Because
I would encourage you not to do that.
Yeah, I would too.
I think
Well-
you want, because I think we need to make sure that we're not talking about teachers, students who have warm feelings toward their teachers in a positive way. We want them to have close emotional relationships with their teachers. We
This
want
says
them to trust
intimate.
them. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about inappropriate emotional, I don't know.
I think inappropriate is a good word to keep it. I think
Where-
that
Which
we're
section?
on,
We're on prohibited
conduct,
conduct,
B.
letter B, page 56 of your packet.
inappropriate is a word that leaves lots of room for interpretation.
but it narrows it down from not having any qualifier on there.
It also gives you more leeway in determining that you think a line has been crossed. One of the problems with enumerating offenses, and it's why even in your student discipline policy, after you enumerate all the offenses, there's this catch-all phrase that says, or anything else that we think is, disruptive to the school. You need to have that flexibility because the fear is people will look at that, and you've listed 6 things. They're saying, well, in between 5 and 6, there's this gray area, so I'm going to do X. And I think the goal in writing it is to keep it as broad as possible so that supervisors have great discretion to say,
Yes.
as your supervisor, we believe that's inappropriate and that must stop.
So
I
this
don't
isn't,
But if you read it without that word, what it prohibits is fostering, encouraging, or participating in emotionally or socially intimate relationships with students in which the relationship is outside the bounds of the reasonable professional staff-student relationship, and goes on. It's pretty clear without it.
Well, I agree with that. It does go on.
the rest of the clause does help.
Because here's what I'm saying, there's not an appropriate emotionally, socially intimate relationship that's outside the bounds of reasonable professional staff. So we don't need to say appropriate, inappropriate, it doesn't exist.
I would check the only thing I would do is I would check the language of the ethics code to make sure that's not taken whole out of the ethics code that they're required to sign.
Well, even if it is, we can still take a word out of it.
And then where it says appropriate in letter C, initiating or continuing communications with students for reason unrelated to any appropriate purpose, I would change that unrelated to any school purpose.
Okay, and in B, I'm wondering, is
I
that,
want to address that
Okay.
before we go on.
Yep.
You have, I've looked at your policy, for example, on tutoring, which prohibits you from tutoring students who you are teaching, but doesn't prohibit you from tutoring other students within the district. That may be, I don't know whether that's something you guys are talking about reconsidering, but at least right now, you allow that. So presumably these people have to be able to communicate for that purpose. That would be an appropriate purpose. Some of them may be their Sunday school teachers, or maybe also the parent of a neighbor or parent. So there may be other appropriate reasons other than school-related reasons why staff is speaking to students. You just have to be careful that you're not prohibiting conduct. You know, my aunt, who's a teacher here, now reads this policy saying she can't call me or she can't babysit me. That's not what you mean.
right, okay.
So how would you, just be devil's advocate for a second,
Sure.
because I understand what you're saying about, you know, Sunday school teacher, whatever, neighbor. How would you prohibit someone who is employed by the district from, let's say, meeting up with groups of kids on Saturday morning to play some basketball together? Or, you know, something where there's no other adults. This is just, you know, this guy and like a couple kids, and they're gonna get together without adults and play basketball or go for walks or whatever else that establishes this relationship where something wrong could happen. That's where I'm
Yeah,
going
and
with this.
I would point you to on the first page, and I think this should be part of our new policy as well. On the first page of this policy, the second paragraph at the end, no district employee shall engage in any social activity or any social relationships with students outside of school unless the employee notifies the superintendent or principal in advance, which provides that check and balance. And I also think then D, socializing with students outside of class time for reasons unrelated to any appropriate purpose. Now I see appropriate, you know, is that appropriate or not? That would be subject to some interpretation. But
Julie, that first
Superintendent or a
sentence.
principal and a parent.
mm-hmm.
It should be
Oh, I like
superintendent or
that.
a principal and a parent.
Yep, that's a good
And
idea.
get-
Guardian.
And
'Cause
get, can I make a comment on that same sentence since we're on that sentence?
Mhm.
It says just notify. How about we get approval
Yeah.
in advance?
I mean,
I don't think that it's okay to just say, I'm meeting these kids to play basketball on the weekend, see ya.
the thing is, you hear it from time to time about interactions that happen in the community where there's something, where there's a, I'll say teacher, could be a staff member, but a teacher having an interaction with kids off school grounds, not part of a school activity, let's say taking kids to lunch. Now,
Superintendent takes kids to lunch.
different, because this is a sanctioned activity, you're not alone with kids, you're
But I get
with a student.
approval, using Mark's word.
Correct.
Parents have to give me approval.
No, so I'm just going to make up a scenario. A teacher who would like to have a friendly relationship with former student who's still in the district but no longer in their class, and so going to take said student to breakfast or to lunch, maybe do this several times. One could imagine, gosh, we love our teachers in Lake Bluff, they're great. Maybe that's fine with you. But if you consider the fact that a sex offender likely offends 67 times on average before they're apprehended, maybe we don't want to allow that kind of contact.
I think you have to be careful about prohibiting people's daily lives from taking place. If these are, so for example, again, someone who lives in your community goes to the basketball court on Saturday with a buddy or two, and then some kids show up, do they have to throw them off the court? Because those are kids who are in the district? So you do
The
want
situation I'm thinking of is not a person who lives in the district. Actually, two cases where they did not live in the district, and I get what you're saying. People are out in a public place, but this is a component of situations that have been a problem.
And you're absolutely right. It is a component of situations that have been a problem, but it is also a component of how many teachers live their lives in positive ways and have positive interactions. And I think that you want to be careful that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
That we want to protect our kids, and I think that talking about those things and trying to come up with how do we draw that line carefully is important.
Mhm.
I think drawing it so broadly that we say no student and no teacher or no staff member can ever have personal interactions outside of school can do a lot of harm
I agree with that.
in addition to protecting
Yep.
from harm. And so you want to, I think.
I don't disagree with you. I'm just trying to draw
I
a
know
nuance of
everybody
this.
talks it through though, because
Yeah.
it has resulted in issues.
I mean, I've seen it both result in issues and not resulted in issues.
So, I have a couple things to add. It is 25 to 8. My executive decision as a superintendent is we're not going to go back and talk about those other policies tonight.
Right.
We'll finish this discussion, but we need to wrap up and decide next steps by about 10 to 8 tonight.
So,
Okay.
one other observation here, all of a sudden at the very end of this policy, we trot out the term fraternization violation, where we haven't used that term before. It seems misplaced. I mean, I guess I understand that it's a reference to this prohibited conduct as a whole, but it's a strange appearance of that term all of a sudden.
Yeah, I agree. The other word,
I don't
No, we
know whether it does or not, or whether that's from a
So only
different
place
version.
that
yeah, we'll
Yeah.
change that word. And then,
You may simply want to refer to violation of the conduct prohibited above.
Right,
right.
Yes, exactly.
Conduct
Yeah,
prohibited
okay.
above.
other wordsmithing change in B, now should it be and, or should be or instead of and? So a relationship is outside the bounds of reasonable professional student-staff relationship. Now it says and in which the relationship could reasonably cause a student to view the staff person as more than a teacher. I think it should be or.
Or,
So it's outside the bounds of a reasonable relationship, or it could reasonably cause a student to view the person in an inappropriate light. So I would change that. And then in C, initiating or rather than continuing communications, I think it should be initiating or engaging in communications with students. But again, we can wordsmith it more when we see it as a standalone policy too.
well, no, because we're gonna wordsmith it here and carry it
Yeah.
all as a
Together.
whole.
It's gonna
Yeah,
have
but
to
both of
change
them are
to
going to go
places.
through 3 readings and everything. So I want to get through the bulk of it. So because we have limited time, I'm
The
trying.
only thing I think may be a reference to in continuing, and this may be to protect the educator, that engaging in, you want to be clear that it's not, you've received something unsolicited, and therefore because you received it, have you engaged in the communication? And that may be what the meaning was behind continuing,
I see.
initiating or continuing, because you don't want someone to be able to send you something and then
Yeah,
you
you're in
don't
trouble.
reciprocate in any way.
Right.
Well,
Yes.
that's engaging, I read is in both
Yeah.
sides.
I do
Yeah.
too. We can wordsmith
You,
it.
I mean, you
receive
want
it.
somebody to, if they received something from a student, for some reason the student has the teacher's cell phone number and sends the teacher, hey, can I come talk to you before school tomorrow? You would want the teacher to turn around and reply and cover the parent or guardian at the same time. Or the principal, like another responsible adult. So I don't know if this is a place where we want to make that explicit. Again, I feel like we need to say it in a few different places because it's kind of vague now.
So I'm gonna put in a question mark, and that's a place that we're gonna need to go back to revisit.
And then again to the principals, anything that you think we should supplement this policy with? Any additional?
The only things that came to mind for me had already been mentioned. The tutoring, it was a tutoring policy, so it sounds as though that's already addressed.
Right now, though, we do use our teachers for tutoring.
We need to revisit it.
We do.
The only thing I would tell you is when we have kids that, I'm gonna give an example, are home very sick, it's our teachers that understand our curriculum and can help those kids. Otherwise, a parent is responsible, or will be responsible, right? If they're homebound tutoring, we're responsible for finding the tutor to our guidance
So
at home.
there's 2 layers. I think that what Nate was sort of referring to is the private tutoring business, and then what you're
Yeah.
referring to is the
Homebound.
district required homebound tutoring for students who are absent for a certain number of days. So.
I do think we need to define the private tutoring a little bit further.
I think that does need to be looked at more comprehensively on a lot of
But
levels.
even from what I understand, the homebound tutoring aspect, I mean, that is a nexus to the district, first of all, and it is occurring in the home. So there are certainly good practices that we need to put into place with homebound tutors, so that are a part of our procedures. And I don't know if that needs to be a part of a policy.
Right. And there's something too, just, communicating to parents that, people lulled into a false sense of security because it's a teacher. And I think people sometimes assume, we can't guarantee, we don't want to be in that position. We want people to think about it.
I wonder, so here, I had a thought process of this. I wondered, maybe, so the teacher has to inform the principal when they have such a relationship, in theory, that's what it says, right? That they have contact with a student outside the school, they should be informing their supervisor. I wondered if, maybe the family would sign a paper saying, we understand the school has nothing to do with this, the school is not providing any supervision to this teacher, and this is purely a relationship that we established do it in some legally appropriate language.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Some
my
kind of
next thought
release.
was, now we've got the school having to manage some kind of
I was
mini
thinking about
contract or something. It's like another layer of paperwork and
It
administration.
keeps
for
increasing
people.
our responsibility over and over, but on the other hand, I think it will cut back on some of those.
Could release a liability.
Right.
Yeah, because I think it is important to educate the parents as well in this, because I think sometimes teachers who do tutor outside, as an outside job, then get put in tricky positions. Like, oh, can you just take my son home from school and then you'll tutor, things like that. So I think defining that for everybody is only going to help.
Right. It cuts out the gray area.
Right.
Well, and I think makes really clear to parents, like would hopefully help them to stop and realize, oh, I need to be supervised in this relationship the same way I would any relationship my child has, and not think that somehow the school has a golden umbrella that is making it safe.
I got a question on item D on this. We kind of talked about it a little bit. Socializing with students outside of class time for reasons unrelated to any appropriate purpose. The vagueness there concerns me, and I wonder about including some specifics as examples, but not limited to, and because of the topical nature of this, things that come to mind that we've heard over the past 3 months having to do with stories about house sitting, babysitting, going on family
Pet
trips. We've
travel,
we've heard this
travel.
happening, not too, in the modern era as well.
He's talking about everything that we just heard about in this case.
Yeah. And I wonder if there should be some examples or, I don't know, more specifics there.
I mean, and can we say,
and we can never come up with
discourage or-
everything, but.
Yeah.
And then you talk about, you get into that gray area you were just specifically talking about, where do you regulate it? How far can you go in regulating a teacher's life outside of the school? I don't know. But I mean, we don't want to do what have happened, what has happened in the past.
Right, and again, I understand that you may want to solicit some parent feedback, though. How many people in your community would be negatively impacted if you said, no, not just no teacher, no staff member can be hired to walk your dog anymore. Can be your house sitter, even though you trust them and they've been doing this for 15 years.
And then they keep doing it, then what's our job in enforcing that?
Right.
And that,
It seems like beyond what we should have the authority to say in a way.
And see, I'm sitting here listening because I agree with Mark. These are all things I've heard, and it's heartbreaking. On the other hand, I think of the responsibility of enforcing this, and there's not enough hours in the day for us to do all this.
Right.
Because you're basically enforcing that everybody that works in our district can have no relationships with people in the community.
But if the burden of this comes to the person who's going to do that tutoring or do that side basketball game or whatever it is, if the burden is on them, then it's not worth.
Yeah,
so
but
much
it's our
for you.
responsibility then to provide the
Enforce it.
discipline if they're, because,
Yeah,
I'm playing this out.
that is a union issue.
Yeah.
It is a union issue.
That one, I agree with.
And I think it's
We're
going to be a
gonna-
community issue as well. I think
Uh-huh.
you're going to
Yeah.
have people in your community very angry.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, I get it.
So then the question gets, which I put down here, Mark, are we gonna give more specifics? It's something we have to reflect on. All right, so moving ahead to personal technology and social media, I would tell you a reminder that we went through this and made some significant changes to this in February of 17. I don't know what, if anything, you want put into our policy XYZ.
Which one are we on?
I'm on policy 5.125 on page 58. And for time purposes, this will probably be the last time when we get to tonight.
I mean, I think again, like on number 2, it says using a district provided method whenever possible. I would use always.
Always.
Or only.
Yeah.
I think you should think about the fact that emergencies occur, that there are people who may, if you're the coach and you can't find, or your teacher and you can't find student A on a field trip, and you're terrified because you can't find student A, and you say to one of the other kids, does anyone have Nancy's cell phone number? And I text her and I say, where are you? And I text back, I have a terrible stomach ache, I'm throwing up in the bathroom, that would be helpful. That you want your teacher not to think, oh my God, I'm not allowed to do that.
Right.
So I think you want to be careful, particularly when you're dealing with field trips, especially your older kids, your sports teams. There are times when, at the last minute, something changes.
And don't we have on our,
And if everyone doesn't have a district cell phone with them,
Nobody, we're not doing that either.
then there will be times when they may decide for safety reasons, they need to make an immediate
and
contact.
Gene, don't we all of our teachers have on their smartphone, their personal smartphones, that safety
Yep, crisis scope.
software for if we had an active shooter or something like that? So we rely on those personal devices.
We do.
I mean, how do you work around that?
And I do think whenever possible, because my only thing is then they need to copy a parent. When they communicate with that, they need to copy a parent, or in the example Nancy gave, if I don't know the parent's cell phone number, I would copy my principal. If I'm a teacher.
So maybe it's
All your teachers know your cell phone numbers, correct?
Oh, yeah.
So then the communication, and any communication with a student would have to, should always, or whenever possible, originate on a school device, but always needs to include the parent or guardian and the administrator. I mean,
And or
May I ask a question? Device or account?
And
account.
And to piggyback on that, so the more recent language that our students have been learning about and that we've been learning about is this whole notion of synchronous and asynchronous and non-synchronous accounts. So if Margaret and I would like to be friends on Facebook, Margaret actually has to accept my friend request on Facebook. If Nate and I want to interact with each other on Instagram, that is a little bit asynchronous because Nate may have his photos may be unlocked, so I may be able to see his photos that are there. So that's just an example. So Nate's point is well taken, because is it just a district-owned device? Is it an LB65 account? Is it that we don't want teachers posting on Instagram accounts so that students can see that?
All
like,
that.
Where is that line drawn for yourselves?
all that. I mean, I think for the purpose of this particular policy, we're talking about, phone calls and emails kind of stuff. I don't think but that other thing you're talking about with Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, that is all in the other policy about technology.
I want to stop you because I told you I was going to stop you right around 10 to 8. I think we need to leave off on this personal technology. If you flip through your packets, I'm giving homework because we're going to have to decide when we're going to meet. I pulled the policy on employment and dismissal. As you'll notice, the majority of it refers to the teacher contract. Student social and emotional development, or one of the policies Nancy and I talked about today, involves a curriculum policy about teaching children when to report, how to report, really making sure that children feel comfortable reporting to an adult of some kind. Access to electronic networks ties in with the technology
So
policy.
Gene, just to be clear, that last one you were suggesting is not something we have. It's
We
something
don't have,
need to
it's another one we're gonna have to add in. I feel like we need to go back and just mention again, even though I'm gonna go on record, the board has discussed field trips. We did the survey on the DC. We know that the community values our field trips, but given our discussions, I think parents just have to be aware we do our very best. We have a lot of things in place for what happens when our kids go on field trips, but they're still outside the school district. I think we need to talk about that. We need to talk a little bit about the liability, which is no different for a field trip in-state versus out-of-state, and Jay can talk about that. We've got our private tutoring policy. We've got which, by the way, I know you spent quite a bit of time on literally a couple months before I got here. So you have 4 board members that need to be brought up to speed on that. We've got harassment of students, we've got our bullying policy, we've got our conduct code for participants in extracurricular activities, specifically because many of our coaches and extracurricular teachers are with kids outside of school day. So that's something we need to review.
I would just say though, with regard to those policies, 240 and 300, those policies address the conduct of students. So to the extent that the focus of this is really on extra staff and how they interact with students, those 2 policies don't address that issue.
We may want to pull those, or I'll leave them in and we'll just mark them out. We have our visitors on school property. Getting back to, we have equipment in our buildings that driver's license are scanned for the first time. I know at the high school they scan me every time I go. So I don't know if you guys do, maybe they just pick me out.
No, they do.
So what we're going to need to do in my office is go through the notes for tonight, start our 2 things, start the list, the safety list, start policy XYZ, and we're going to need to set up another policy meeting. We're a few weeks from the end of the school year and summer vacation, so you guys are going to have to tell me what you want to do and when you want to meet the next time.
Can I make a suggestion or a request first? This personal technology and social media policy, I almost wonder if this is a situation where administration should look at it and propose some language that updates it in regards to some of the things that Kevin was talking about. Because I think for us, it may take quite a while to come up with it. It might be more efficient if you guys.
We'd be happy to take a look at that.
Okay.
So what do you want to do about a meeting? Because we could meet in June, we could meet in August, end of August, beginning of August. You have to tell me what you want to do. Nancy,
I'd rather meet in June.
I think we need to move in June. I don't think we can wait till August.
Okay,
Right,
so
school's
with
still in
that
session.
in mind, I will send out some dates tomorrow for all of you, and so everyone knows how to doodle. Nancy, you're going to have to send me your dates first, though.
Right, I have to say, I have, as we discussed early on, I have very limited dates in June, unfortunately, because of my travel schedule. So I think there's only.
Nancy, while you're
So-
here then, let me just ask the question. I mean, when you look at, was your process to go through press and think about how to, I don't know if you had a process or an idea, are you seeing gaps, things that you think we should think about filling?
Right. I went through I didn't look at press. I looked at your policy manual on the assumption, knowing you that there it was unlikely that there was a sort of a press policy you decided not to adopt. Just left it open. And I was really using this as an opportunity, from my perspective, you certainly covered all the bases with your policy. And as I discussed with Dr. Sophie when I came here, actually the first thing that's written on my legal pad for tonight is to get an understanding from you all of what your goal was. What is it you want to achieve with this? And it sounds like what you want to achieve is simply to make this more transparent. It does feel very opaque. And that your goal is to create some level of transparency, and that it may be that very little in the substance of the policies really needs to be changed, but we need to put it together in a way that makes you comfortable, that you're taking the steps you need to protect the community.
Yeah, but
That it's more transparent for students, for parents, and that the administration knows how to move forward.
Yeah, I don't know that transparency is the word I use, but more user friendly. But my question is, that's what we came in with. But you're the expert. You looked at the policies. Did you see anything where you thought, I've seen other school districts have this kind of policy. I think Lake Bluff should think about this, or I see a big gaping hole here. I mean, did you have any affirmative suggestions beyond what we may have?
I didn't see anything besides tinkering that I thought we needed to do. No, I thought it was pretty comprehensive what you had already.
Substantively, the one idea I had that I cryptically put in an email to you was, if we have a procedure that's more clearly invites people to register their concerns about how their child's been treated, and then we take it from there and decide whether or not it violates any of these policies, however we do that. I'd like to know on some regular basis how many of those complaints are coming in. Like I was thinking of an oversight role. I don't need to know the details of every one of them, but we have 5 this quarter, or did we have 2 this quarter, or did we see a spike last quarter? Yeah, I think some kind of feedback to us about what kind of traffic that is getting. I know we've talked about some of the anonymous complaints that you have, and that it's not very much used much.
It's not, and it wouldn't even be worthy of a report. The
Right.
reports would have to come up when we actually get
Because it's less people.
the issues.
So one thing to think about is whether the board can do some kind of oversight role, have some kind of oversight role that shows that we're paying attention to trends, to their extent there is trends. If we see, the same person keeps coming up and that
You
kind of
guys
thing.
can't know the people though.
Not in open.
Technically,
I mean, not
not
not the children, but if it's a
We could talk
potential
about
discipline
trends.
issue. But if it's a discipline issue or a conduct issue of one of our employees, we can't know the employee.
If you're, I thought you were talking about students.
No, I was talking about the parent or the teachers.
But you
But
guys always know about employee issues.
okay,
Those always.
maybe that's just part of a policy somewhere that we serve some kind of oversight.
I mean, something as
function.
simple as those anonymous forms that are being done, or the complaints, that the board would be informed of those complaints when they come
When they come in, or
or
as
the
they
number
get
of
resolved.
complaints that come in per quarter, or something like that. I don't know.
And maybe the number is typically 0. I don't. That would be good to know.
All
But
right,
the
I have dates, so I would like you to, I only have 2 dates because of my wedding and my family, of Nancy's that I could do it. One is, on the date we canceled the committee of the whole meeting, so that would be Tuesday, June 6th. And another one is Monday, June 19th.
The 6th will work for me.
6 works for me.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
we had that
me
on our
too.
calendars anyway.
Yeah.
So our next meeting will be the 6th. I want everyone to go home. I'll work with Nancy in the interim, and I'll start putting some of this together and talk to Terry also.
Right.
But if there's ideas that you get or whatever, send them to me.
I'm going to give you one more right now, and that is the harassment of students prohibited. I would like different standards for teacher harassment versus student harassment if we even have to address student harassment, because it may be addressed elsewhere. But
It's addressed in 7.19.
okay, then this one for
I'm sorry, which number are we on right now?
720. Because I think
This is about students though.
And it also
Staff
says
is in
students.
section 5.
It was any person, including a district
Yeah,
employee
I see
or
what
a
you're
student
saying.
engages in sexual
right,
harassment.
right, yeah. No, this
Shelley, did you get that one
And
down?
this is the standard that comes out of federal case law.
I know, and our standard's going to be higher because I know, substantially interfering. Well, we can talk about it later, but an intimidating, hostile, or offensive educational environment is a pretty high standard for sexual harassment. We may not be legally liable, but we'd rather prohibit even a lower grade kind of sexual harassment.
It's understandable we want for students. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
So now is this something, it's the end of the school year, so I don't know necessarily if I want to volunteer all of our administrators to be here. Will it be okay if it's just me? Do you want our district office? For instance, with the technology, if Kevin and Jay could come, they could articulate that. I need to be protective of their time because there's a lot going on those last couple of weeks in school.
And I think the building administrators don't need to sit through the whole thing, but they are going to be key to getting the overarching communications, policies, statement of intent, whatever we call these, into a form that's complete and will be useful to the parents in their buildings. So,
I don't think we're far enough along though.
no, I know.
for
This
that right
next
now.
time, I think no, but I think.
As we move into August and start really
Yes.
putting some of this together.
And I envision having something supplementing the student handbook that says here are a guide to all of the things we're doing to ensure safety.
I prefer it wouldn't be a supplement, but it's actually part of,
Maybe.
because that's our legal contract.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine with me too. But I think drawing attention to it as a new section, it would be let's put some attention to it. And so our goal is to have that done and ready for the beginning of school.
So are all of you willing to work through the summer? Because I know I work all summer. All of you guys go on vacation. So
Not the whole summer.
I'm just saying, because I'm going to remind all of you, like I've reminded the staff, last summer we had a very long summer. This summer we have a very short summer.
Yes, that's true.
Maybe we
So-
should adjourn if we have other scheduling stuff to talk about. We don't need to be.
Yeah, I think at this point, we have our next meeting. I will put it together. Some of the meeting is going to have to be logistics. So we'll discuss
These
logistics.
big picture things can be drafted in advance. I think we'll get a lot farther. I mean, if you can maybe go through the exercise of pulling them all into one document for interaction and one document for student safety measures, and maybe just paren after each line, paren where did it come from, so we could find the origin document easily. I think that would be very helpful.
We can work on that piece.
So I
It's
think
still
that
gonna be
I think
tweaked,
that
so.
would move things along. And then, of course, if we have edits to the underlying policies, we'll have to edit in both places. But I think
We'll handle that piece because that's going to have to go to the top of the policy.
Gene, I don't know if anybody's ever asked this before, but is there any way to find out or any idea if anybody in the state has ever tackled this kind of a thing, putting it all in one place?
I put out something to the superintendents in the state. and-
Because if why reinvent the wheel if somebody's already done it?
Right. Surely they have.
I'd be surprised if anyone had.
No.
Yeah.
Really?
I bet you
So-
ours are more complete than anything.
Don't-
I would venture to bet, in my experience, that our board policy manual is probably one of the better ones as it exists now.
Well, then when we do this and make it really amazing, maybe we want to share it with press.
Sell it.
For a
we should
charge.
sell it to
Or present it. Mark, you could present it or we could present it at the school board conference.
I would love to be able to do that, guys. We didn't meet the
Ooh.
deadline for presentation this year. We
Damn.
could present it the next year. I asked you guys 2 years in a row to do that. On that note, I think we'd adjourn unless anybody has any public comment? Oh, we got there. With that being said, we're done for the evening. Thank you for coming.